On December 8, 1991, 3 men drove to a hunting lodge in the Belarusian forest. They sat down at a table. They signed a document. And with those 3 signatures, the world's largest empire, 290 million people, 15 republics, 70 years of Soviet power, ceased to exist. It took less time than most board meetings. No war preceded it, no revolution, no foreign invasion. The Soviet Union had 27,000 nuclear warheads. It had the largest conventional military in human history. It had the KGB, 500,000 agents embedded in every institution, every workplace, every apartment block in the country. And yet when the moment came, almost no one tried to stop it. That is the mystery, and the answer is far stranger than anything you were taught in school. To understand how a superpower dissolves, you first have to understand what the Soviet Union actually was. Not the version from Cold War films, not the monolithic enemy, but the actual system that 300 million people lived inside for 7 decades. The Soviet Union was built on a promise. The promise was this: sacrifice your individual freedom today, and in return you will receive security, equality, and eventually a communist utopia unlike anything capitalism could offer. The state would provide housing, employment, education, healthcare, and meaning. In exchange, citizens would surrender their right to dissent, their right to travel, their right to information, and their right to choose who governed them. For a time, and in certain ways, the system delivered. Literacy rates soared. The Soviet Union won the space race. It defeated Nazi Germany in the most costly military campaign in human history. It built an industrial empire from scratch in a single generation. By the 1960s, Soviet citizens genuinely believed they were living in the future. But something had begun to rot beneath the surface. And by the 1980s, the rot had reached the foundations. The Soviet economy had one fatal vulnerability: oil. By the mid-1980s, petroleum exports accounted for more than 60% of the Soviet Union's hard currency earnings. The entire imperial budget, the military, the welfare state, the subsidized republics, the space program, depended on oil staying expensive. In 1986, it didn't. Oil prices collapsed from $30 a barrel to $10. Almost overnight, the Soviet state lost more than half its foreign revenue. The budget deficit exploded, and the consequences showed up almost immediately. Not in government announcements, which remained upbeat, but in ordinary life. Store shelves emptied. Basic goods disappeared. People stood in lines for hours for bread, for soap, for shoes. Workers were paid in vouchers that couldn't buy anything. The official line was that the economy was growing. The reality was that the system was quietly starving. This was the context when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. He understood that the Soviet Union was in serious trouble. What he did not understand, what no one in the Kremlin understood, was how close the system was to the edge. Gorbachev launched 2 historic reforms: Glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Both were designed to save the Soviet Union. Both helped destroy it. Glasnost was the more dangerous of the 2. For the first time in Soviet history, the press was allowed to report critically. Citizens could speak about things that had been forbidden for decades, and what came out was devastating. The true scale of Stalin's purges, the real death toll in Afghanistan, 15,000 Soviet soldiers killed in a war the government had called a humanitarian mission, the full story of Chernobyl, where a nuclear reactor had exploded in 1986 and the state had tried to hide it from its own people while the radiation spread across Europe. Every revelation eroded trust. Every truth that had been suppressed for decades, now spoken aloud, made the official version of Soviet history look like what it was: a lie maintained by force. And once people understood that the government had been lying about the past, they stopped believing its promises about the future. Perestroika made the economic situation worse. Dismantling the command economy without replacing it with functioning markets created chaos. Enterprises that had been told what to produce, at what price, for whom, suddenly found themselves adrift. Inflation surged. Supply chains fractured. The transition that was supposed to modernize the economy instead accelerated its breakdown. And then the nationalists came. The Soviet Union had always been a vast multi-ethnic empire held together by Russian political dominance and the iron logic of communist ideology. When the ideology began to hollow out, the centrifugal forces that had been suppressed for decades started pulling at the seams. The Baltic states moved first. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been occupied by the Soviet Union in 1940 under a secret deal with Nazi Germany. They had never fully accepted Soviet rule, and Glasnost gave them the opening they needed. By 1990, all three had declared independence. Moscow threatened, maneuvered, even sent troops, but did not massacre. The restraint was unprecedented, and it sent a signal to every other republic watching. The center would not do what it had always done before. Ukraine followed, then Georgia, then Armenia, then Kazakhstan. One by one, the republics held elections, declared sovereignty, and stopped sending tax revenues to Moscow. The Soviet state was being defunded by its own members in real time. Gorbachev found himself negotiating to keep a union together that its parts had already decided to leave. Then came August 1991, a group of communist hardliners. The old guard who believed Gorbachev was destroying everything they had built, launched a coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest in his Crimean dacha. They announced on state television that he was ill and that they had assumed control. Tanks rolled into Moscow. It should have worked. Every previous challenge to Soviet authority had been crushed by exactly this method. But something was different this time. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, climbed on top of one of the tanks outside the Russian parliament building and called on citizens to resist. Crowds gathered, and the crucial moment came. The army commanders looked at the crowds, looked at their orders to disperse them by force, and refused. The soldiers would not fire. The coup collapsed in 72 hours. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but everything had changed. The Communist Party, which had ordered the coup, was suspended. The KGB, which had participated, was discredited. The last institutions that held the Soviet system together had destroyed their own authority in 3 days. The 3 signatures in the Belarussian forest, 4 months later, were not the cause of the collapse. They were the official acknowledgement of something that had already happened. The Soviet Union had not been defeated. It had been abandoned by its own citizens, its own soldiers, its own leaders, because it had failed at the one thing that makes any government legitimate. It had stopped being worth defending. Historians who study how empires fall identify a consistent pattern. Military power, economic resources, and institutional control are the visible architecture of a state. But beneath all of them runs something invisible and far more essential: the shared belief that the system deserves to continue. Call it legitimacy. Call it consent. Call it faith. When that belief erodes past a certain point, no force can restore it. You cannot shoot your way back to legitimacy once it is gone. The Soviet Union is the most dramatic modern example of this truth. It didn't fall because the West outspent it, though it was outspent. It didn't fall because capitalism proved superior, though many argue it did. It fell because the gap between what the system claimed to be and what it actually was became too wide to bridge. When Glasnost lit that gap up for everyone to see, the belief that had held the empire together simply dissolved. This pattern did not begin or end with the Soviet Union. The Shah of Iran, one of the most militarily equipped rulers of the 20th century, fled his country in 1979 without a single battle. Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania was overthrown in 8 days in 1989 after 25 years of absolute power because his security forces decided that protecting him was no longer worth the cost. In each case, the moment the defenders stopped believing, the empire was already over. What rose from the ruins of the Soviet Union were 15 new nations, each inheriting a different piece of the wreckage. For some people, December 26, 1991 was liberation, the most important day of their lives. For others, it was catastrophe, the destruction of the only world they had ever known. Russia lost 40% of its GDP in 5 years. Life expectancy fell. The oligarchs rose. The chaos of the 1990s left wounds that have never fully healed. The 3 men who signed the papers in the forest probably did not understand the full weight of what they were creating. They were solving an immediate political crisis. They were not designing a new world order. But that is how history moves. Not through grand plans, but through decisions made in small rooms by exhausted men who have run out of other options. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin on Christmas Day, 1991. The Russian tricolor went up in its place. Mikhail Gorbachev gave his resignation speech on television. He seemed, by all accounts, deeply sad. He had tried to save a system he believed in. And in trying to save it, he had allowed enough truth into the room to let people see it clearly for the first time. And once they saw it clearly, there was nothing left to save. The largest empire of the 20th century ended not with a war, not with a battle, not even with a protest. It ended with a moment of collective recognition. A quiet, devastating, unstoppable understanding that spread through 300 million people over the course of a few years. The understanding that the thing they had been told was worth everything was not worth defending at all.